Hi, my name is Tim Porteus. I'm a storyteller and I do a bit of writing. And I've been asked to tell you 3 stories for this wonderful festival. And now, in thinking about which stories to tell you, the first one was kind of easy because it's a story that's close to my heart. Partly because of its setting, Trepain Law or Dumpelder, as it was also known. Now, ever since I was wee, before the modern A1 was built, I remember driving in my car with my dad driving in the back of my wee Morris Minor, the wee Morris Minor we have that kind of left all the pollution and made funny noises as it would drive. It probably wouldn't be allowed on the roads now. And we'd drive past and we'd see this hill rising from the landscape like a magic altar. And of course geologists will tell you all about the volcanic origins of Trepain Law, but for me it seemed like a magical mountain. And I asked, could we climb to the top of it? But my dad and my mum weren't really hill walkers, and so I had to wait till I grew up to get the opportunity to climb to the top. And it was after I'd finished history at university, I took the opportunity to organise a little expedition with some friends, and we actually spent the night on the summit at midsummer. It seemed an obvious place to do this because by then I had already read a little bit about the history or the prehistory of this remarkable hill, Trepain Law, how it was once a Celtic fort. And as you climb up the top, you can see the walls as you climb up. If you look really careful, you can see some of the outlines of the roundhouses that were, and the summit, of course, gives you a beautiful view of East Lothian. And we spent the night there, and the sun rose in the morning. But when it got dark and cold, we had to huddle somewhere, and we found this wee cranny where we could hide behind a rock that sheltered us a bit from the wind and the cool breeze from that night. And in the morning, as the sun came up and spread its kind of golden rays across the hill, I noticed that where we had spent the night looked as if there had been something there before. It was a kind of rectangular shape. Now, it was history I studied, not archaeology, but I had a kind of untrained eye, amateur, and I thought, you know what, this looks like there's something that's been here, but I couldn't really say for sure. Just could have been my imagination and my wishful thinking. And so began my real love affair with Trepain Law. Not long after this, in reading some early religious writings, I discovered the great legend I'm just about to tell you. Now this legend is really overlaid on some really fascinating archaeological discoveries. I was lucky enough recently to go with a group of people with Dr. Fraser Hunter, who revealed many of the things that have been discovered on the hills. One of the things he told us was that one of the entrances on the west was bigger than the others, and he reckoned it was an entrance for chariots. Oh, kind of really fired my imagination. And of course there's a story of the treasure that was buried there as well in the 5th century. And Dumpelder itself, that the term could very likely mean the fort of the spears. Now, after the Roman period, the fort was reoccupied quite heavily again and was refortified. The idea, fort of the spears, it gives you this idea, this kind of fortress bristling with spikes. And it's round about this time that this legendary tale takes place. According to the legend, the king who ruled from this fortress was known as King Loth or King Lot or King Ludin. And this king was a pagan king, a rather cruel and brutal man. And he had a young daughter, Fenyu or Theni. Well, I'll call her Fenyu. And Fenyu had become a Christian. Now, as is always the case in such stories, the big question for a princess, of which Fenyu was was who should she marry. And King Loth wanted her to marry a prince from the west, from a Brittonic kingdom in the west, Prince Ewan. Now, he was handsome and he was okay looking, but his character wasn't what she wanted. Fenyu, becoming a Christian, had a kind of certain way of being, and she wanted someone who fitted her spiritual and moral perspective. Well, in those days, such things, of course, don't really count for anything, and her father, King Loth, initially tried to gently persuade her. Now, look, dear, you're going to have to marry him. I mean, you're a princess and he's a prince. I mean, what's the problem there? But I don't want to marry him, father. I don't love him. Oh, what's love got to do with it? Now, I'm your father. You have to do what you're told. Okay, they wouldn't have spoken Scots, but I can't speak their Brittonic language. Well, of course, she became more defiant. The more her father tried to force her to marry this man, the less she became willing to even think about it. No, father, I'm not going to do it. And so her father got angrier and angrier and finally decided he would teach her a lesson. Right, if you're not going to marry him, what you're going to do is you're going to spend time to think about your privilege and your position with a swineherd in the family. And when you're in the muck and filth with the pigs, perhaps then you'll come to your senses. And so she was banished to a pig farm on the foothills of the Lammermuirs to live with the poor and rough peasant family who were swineherds. The idea was that this would make her see sense, that finally she would agree to marry Prince Owen. But it didn't. It had the opposite effect. She found in the simplicity of this peasant life, in honest hard labour, the filth and the muck, that didn't make her feel less of a person, less of a human being. It made her feel more. She found love and contentment with this kind and honest peasant family who had also turned to the Christian faith. Far more fulfilling than the royal life at top of this bristling fort with all the great privileges of living in the royal tent, as it were. And of course, as the king's spies were feeding back this information to King Loth, no, she's no changing her mind. If anything, she seems to be happy, singing along, really enjoying her life. He was furious, and Prince Owen, who'd been rejected, was even more angry. How could she reject me, a prince, a handsome prince, for the life of for the life of living with pigs and living with swineherds? And people whispered in his ears, "Take her anyway. Once you take her, she'll have no choice." And so one dark night he crept quietly to the swineherd's farm, and then, dressed as a woman, tricked her, took her to a quiet place, and took her violently. She resisted, not just during but after. "You have to come with me now," he says. "No," she said. "You mean to say you'd prefer to stay here with these swine, all these poor people and in muck and filth? Those pigs are better than you will ever be," she said. "Ah, I've had enough." And off he went. Not long after, her belly began to swell. She was pregnant. And of course, very quickly, the king's spies got to hear about this, and he assumed that the young swineherd, the young lad of the family, who did indeed love Fenyu, but in an honourable and respectful way, had been responsible for this, for the dishonour, as he saw it, of his daughter. And his daughter had dishonoured him, the king. And so she was taken back to the great fortress and put on trial. Now the law was clear. She had dishonoured her father. She was to be stoned to death. People thought, "Oh, who's going to stone the princess?" No one really wanted to be the person to throw the deadly stone, and so it was agreed that the stone that would kill her would be the great cliff that falls from the fort on the southern side. So she was put in a chariot, tied to a pole, and taken to the edge. There she prayed. She prayed God to forgive her for all her sins, and she prayed that her father be forgiven. Many people cried with her, and then everyone held their breath as the cart was thrown over the side, crashing down hundreds of feet, smashing to bits. She had some friends at the bottom, and they couldn't believe their eyes when they saw Thenu emerging unharmed from the wreckage. Her baby, her unborn baby, was likewise unharmed, and people fell to their knees proclaiming a miracle. The pole on which she had been tied to embedded itself in the ground at the bottom of the hill, and when it was taken out, a well magically sprung from it. Her father, King Lothian, you would assume that he would accept this as divine judgment, but no. According to the stories, he was a pagan man who refused to accept this. Well, if this was your God that saved you, well, we'll find out how much he loves you. She was punished a second time. This time she was taken to Aberlady, the shore of the stench, as it was known, because of all the fish that used to rot there. So great was the catch in those days. And she was put upon a coracle, a kind of circular shaped little boat made with hides, and there she was pulled out on the tide and then set free. She was going to drown out in the sea. Wailing and crying could be heard as her little coracle slowly swept out to sea, and finally she could hear no one except for the gulls above her and the lapping of the waves. May Island approached, and she hoped that perhaps she could land on the rocky shores of May Island, but the tide took her away from May Island. There a small little rock appeared in front of her, and then it was the open sea. It was hopeless, and she desperately lay back, prayed, of course, to God, for only God now surely could help her. Above her, the seabirds flew, and around her, shoals of fish swam. And as night time came, and she prayed and prayed, tiredness overwhelmed her, and she fell asleep. When she woke the next morning, the sun had risen, but there was mist. The sea was calm, and as the mist lifted, she could see a shore. She desperately paddled towards the shore, and the last wave brought her gently onto the beach. An exhausted, cold and soaking wet refugee from oppression and tyranny, who had managed to reach safety on an unseaworthy little boat. And there on the shore, she gave birth to her son. She lay with her crying baby, exhausted, almost unable to lift him for being so drained of energy, and the crying of the baby alerted some local shepherds, who immediately took pity on her and warmed her by a fire and helped her. Where she'd landed was close to a place called Curus in Fife, and there was a holy man, Saint Surf. He took Thenu in, gave her shelter and kindness, and helped to raise her son. Her son became Saint Kentigern, a patron saint in Glasgow. So began another story. But what happened to King Loth? Well, after setting his daughter adrift on the little coracle, he reckoned his honour would not be satisfied until he found what he considered to be the culprit of his daughter's dishonour, the swineherd. So he set off to try and find him and kill him. The swineherd, the young lad, well, he knew the landscape and he retreated into marshy land, and soon the hunted became the hunter. He lay in wait for the king, not far from his fortress, and as the king was returning, he jumped out from his hiding place and he threw a spear which pierced the king in the chest. The great king fell crashing down on that spot, and the young swineherd ran for his life. According to legend, King Loth was buried on that very spot, and a mark stone was placed on the location, the Loth Stane as it was later to be called. You can still see it, although it's been moved. It used to be in the middle of the field, it's now on the side of the field. And there's an archaeological story about that. And there's another stone nearby as well, which I think is probably more likely to be the Loth Stone. But anyway, that's a different story. And that little building that I mentioned earlier on, the little rectangular one, from a later period, could that have been a small chapel where the pilgrims coming from the south on their way to perhaps North Berwick to cross over to St Andrews, could these pilgrims have been diverted up to Traprain to pay homage to the mother of St Kentigern? And was that little area where we spent the night, where the chapel was, where they would do so? I don't know, I'm not saying that's definitely the case, but it would be interesting to find out. So that's my first story. As I say, it's a legend. We cannot even say that King Lothian really lived. People say that's where the term Lothian comes from. But that's the thing about legends. They're all kind of mixed up with little bits of peppered history, perhaps. A bit like the Loch Ness Monster. We cannot say for sure that St Columba never did see a great creature in Loch Ness. But for me, the legend of Thenue and the location of Traprain combines to make a most magical, amazing story. And although it might not be true in the conventional sense of the word, there is most definitely a lot of truth in it. An exhausted, cold and soaking wet refugee from oppression and tyranny. Who had managed to reach safety on an unseaworthy little boat, and was shown kindness and compassion, and whose son became a saint.